Hey everyone, there is a lot going on right now in Minneapolis, and I've been making videos about it over the course of the last week or so, and I thought it'd be good to do something more long format, and I have the distinct privilege of the great CJ Kilmer joining me, host of the Dangerous History podcast, to talk through this a bit. CJ, good to see you, and a lot of shit going down right now, I would say.
Yeah, and virtually none of it good, unfortunately.
That's really the sad part. And the other sad part for me is, like, it could be that I'm just ridiculously naive or I'm just remembering things wrong. But to me, right now is a little bit different because you have two very strong, like, elite narratives that are competing against each other that both are completely ridiculous and wrong. Like, typically, with things like this, like, I think back to January 6th, there was a clear right and wrong. Like, the left narrative was so pervasive, ugly, ridiculous, that I found myself siding with the more conservatives on this at the time. But I'm having a hard time. I think everybody sucks on this particular topic. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. It is a very complicated mess. And the sort of dichotomy of American politics seems to just be dominating it in a really profound way that kind of makes both sort of mainstream sides of the narrative kind of stupid. And as often is the case, I'm just a sucker for nuance and for really trying to understand the complexities of things that actually are complex. And so this has probably kept my audience from growing as fast as it would have if I would just, pander to one side stupidly like so many do and make millions of dollars doing it. But I'm someone who very often looks at a situation like this and says, of course, but maybe, and, kind of concludes like, this is not simplistic in any direction.
No, agreed. So maybe what I can do is just lay out the scenario of the story so far, and then we can get into the different narratives that are happening and kind of go from there. So this is what happened. So on January 24th, Alex Preti, 37-year-old VA ICU nurse, was shot and killed by Border Patrol right outside of Glamdal Donuts, I think is the place. And this was during an immigration enforcement operation and also a protest. And so the key sequence is kind of this. Like, so Pretti was part of this. And this is kind of, there's new stuff kind of comes out every couple days. And this was new as of maybe yesterday or the day before. It's still pretty fresh. But Pretti was definitely part of a coordinated rapid response network who were tracking ICE movements. He'd been involved in a protest before. A video came out yesterday that showed him even being violent towards at least a police officer or an ICE vehicle. Well, he arrived on the scene after being alerted. There's this big signal chat with 1,000 people in it, including members of the political class in Minnesota. He intervened when he saw agents not only like approach a woman, but shove her so hard that she hit the ground in a way that when I watched it, like I think I would have reacted similar to him. If I see a woman get hit that hard on the street, no matter who it is, cop, doesn't matter, I would probably step in. It's just like fucking primal. So he intervened. He was immediately pepper sprayed, like violently. It was shocking to watch. Pepper sprayed, tackled to the ground by like half a dozen cops, beat. Like, you could see the fist pummeling. I'd seen this type of thing before in New Hampshire when a group of cops apprehended someone who was doing a high-speed chase. It was really shocking to watch, but they came in swinging hard. Then he was pinned, disarmed, clear that he was disarmed, and then shot approximately 10 times. Like a second after, 2 seconds after he was disarmed. So a broader context too, and I'll let you chime in too, but like, this was the third fatal shooting in the last, say, 3 weeks. 2 Americans. One was Rachel Good, I think. That's a different scenario. I actually thought that she was more at fault in that one. But anyway, there's 3 fatal shootings in Minneapolis in a short amount of time. And so the public is absolutely responding to that. And then also, you know, what's coming to light is with these infiltrated signal chats is that this is sophisticated. It looks like a color revolution. It looks more sophisticated than even the Black Lives Matter stuff that was going on in the Summer of Love in 2020. And that's shocking and hard to watch as well. So that kind of catches us up. Like, what are your thoughts on this, or what did I miss?
I think you got most of the main, details of what happened on the actual incident. And, what probably the thing that has disturbed me the most has been the blatant lies of the Trump administration and the head, what is his name? Bovino. Sounds humorously close to Bongino for some reason. Bovino.
Or bovine, in case you wanted to take that route.
Right. The way that they blatantly lied, just objectively in terms of what happened when you look at the video, and like presumably Kristi Noem, I am sure, had to have seen that video.
Yeah.
Prior to her making her like bizarrely false comments about what actually happened there. And that's probably the most disturbing thing to me, is just how much they immediately started lying about just the facts of what happened, which is largely captured on that video.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that's disturbed me has been watching particularly the hypocrisy of much of the right, where, they're doing the same thing that the Democrats did in regard to, say, the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting, where they are, they're cherry picking certain details that they're, at least by, maybe not always explicitly, but at least tacitly, are trying to say that these particular details indicate some sort of nefarious motive on the part, in this case, of Alex Preti, things which, they're not legal justifications for anything that happened to him, and they also do not necessarily indicate any kind of like malice ahead of time, like that he was looking specifically to try to shoot ICE agents or what have you. Like if that was his plan going out there, then he could have easily like shot at them from across the street,
Of course.
or gone there with a long gun instead of with a small pistol or whatever. The whole thing is a very complicated mess, and I think the problem is that it really doesn't fit neatly into either side's prefab narratives, but they're trying so hard to shoehorn it in. And I guess because it's the right that's more in power in terms of the federal government right now, their hypocrisy I find more egregious and disturbing in this instance. And again, I think it's largely just because they're the ones in power, particularly in the executive branch at the moment.
Yeah, let's take a look at what Noam said here. I actually have that video. Hopefully I can take that up.
This individual showed up to impede a law enforcement operation and assaulted our officers. They responded according to their training and took action to defend the officer's life and those of the public around him. And I don't know of any peaceful protester that shows up with a gun and ammunition rather than a sign. This is a violent riot when you have someone showing up with weapons and are using them to assault law enforcement officers.
That's crazy. That is crazy what you just said there. That you have an individual showing up with a weapon and attacking officers. Like, that's clearly not what happened in that case. He never drew. I hated some of the disturbing statements, not just from her. Like Stephen Miller was another one from the White House, saying ridiculous things, really painting a picture. If you just read these statements or heard Kristi Noem there, you would think that he drew on these officers. Like, that's the picture that they're painting. And I think that's why so many Americans are appalled, because everybody's seen this video and then they heard the administration talk like this and they're like, no, that's not what fucking happened. And I think you're right. In this case, the right hypocrisy is worse. Like, we can get into the left stuff with why Waltz is so gung-ho about sowing dissent and basically a color revolution in Minnesota. We can get into that too. But I'm disturbed by the right because you have people, it's like the Daily Wire conservatives. And typically, I'm really hard on like Shapiro, but typically even Matt Walsh, I find him to be, we don't agree on a lot of things, but I find him to be more reasonable. And for the position that he's taking on this, I just think is crazy. You're right. They are removing some of the nuances here, and they're saying they're painting a picture of this guy to justify the shooting. They're just doing it to justify the shooting. So that's the right hypocrisy is worse for me than when the left. I almost expect it from the left, I think is why, but it's more shocking from the right this time, I think.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of things stood out to me. I mean, I'm a gun guy, and I'm also kind of a moderate immigration hawk, I would say, but I'm not in favor of the ways that they've been going about all of this. It's so just like strategically stupid, even that it's as if the Trump administration was deliberately trying to make any sort of reasonable immigration, enforcement or whatever look insane. It's almost like they're trying to make the left's most hysterical arguments of like even the slightest enforcement of immigration laws equals Nazism and jackboots and whatever, trying to make that seem like they're right. I mean, the idea that, that the fact that he had 2 spare magazines on him proves that he had some sort of nefarious intent. 2 magazines or 2 reloads for your weapon has been like the standard basic law enforcement loadout for an average cop, like not, going to do a tactical thing or whatever, but just like an average, detective or whatever. Two reloads has been the basic minimum since like, I don't even know, probably before World War II.
They made it sound like he had a duffel bag full of weapons, that he was carrying around. It was bullshit. Like, guys.
Yeah, one of the rhetorical questions I asked on Twitter was, someone should ask Kristi Noem, what is the standard ammunition loadout for a sidearm for a federal agent who, again, is not responding to some sort of tactical situation or whatever? And I bet you it's at least 2 extra magazines for whatever they're carrying. So to me, to act like the fact that he had 2 extra mags proves that he had some sort of, homicidal or even terroristic intent is as dishonest as the whole Kyle Rittenhouse carried his gun across state lines. It's like you're cherry picking something that is not, not wrong, not illegal, and is actually, not in any way proof of nefarious intent, and you're doing it in an intellectually dishonest way, hoping that your intended audience is emotionally hysterical and ignorant and not, thinking these things through. And, because somebody who's not familiar with firearms and with carrying a weapon and that sort of thing, yeah, that sounds like, oh no, he even had some reloads. But like any self-defense expert will tell you, if you're, just a civilian carrying a concealed weapon, they'll tell you like you should have at least 1 full reload for whatever it is you're carrying, if not 2.
Yeah.
And so that was just one of the things that jumped out to me that I thought just sort of illustrated this right-wing hypocrisy.
Yeah. And here's what Matt Walsh said. If you dress up in your militia costume, like what he was wearing, of course, that's why he earned it. If you dress up in your militia costume, arm yourself, and then go out into the street with the express intent, he knows what was going on in Pretti's mind, the express intent of interfering with law enforcement, and then fight back when they try to arrest you. Did he fight back, or was he flailing around because he was bear sprayed in the face and tackled? And then you end up dead. You only have yourself to blame. See, they're conflating this whole thing. You can absolutely believe. So the video that came out yesterday was Alex Preti a couple weeks before at another ICE event. He smashed an ICE vehicle rear light or rear lens or whatever. Taillight, spit on, I don't think he spit on a cop, spit on the car, whatever, yelling at them, acting really aggressive. You can say, yeah, this guy was a fucking agitator and it looks like part of a color revolution. You can think that. And then you can also think that it's wrong to shoot a disarmed man who you have beaten, tackled with half a dozen people, and bear sprayed. You have apprehended him at that point. You can't draw and execute at that point. Like, both things can be true. But the way that they're painting it is like the whole what he's wearing and carrying thing from Walsh is crazy. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and he's wearing what sort of look like BDU cargo type pants or whatever, but a lot of people wear those. I wear those all the time. Usually the shorts version because I'm a Florida man.
It's hot.
But I wear usually 511 brand because they're really good. They're durable, but they still breathe. And this is not a paid endorsement.
I was going to say new sponsor.
Because sometimes I'm usually armed with something, but aside from that, I have my various, my flashlight, little EDC tools and things like this. In addition to the usual, wallet, keys and whatever, and having all those pockets is handy. I would imagine that since he's an ICU nurse, he probably had some first aid stuff and whatever, probably at least part of why he was there seems a reasonable thing to guess that he, wanted to be able to render first aid to protesters and things like that. And yeah, when the woman is thrown violently on the ground, he doesn't go at the cops. He goes towards her as if to help her. And that's when, they get physical with him, tackle him down, spray him, all that. They had no idea he even had a weapon until in the scuffle it was exposed. And then, he never went for it. He clearly was just, disoriented, flailing. I mean, if anyone's ever been tackled on the ground by multiple big, strong guys, it's a disorienting situation. And you might say, well, he should have just, gone limp and whatever. But when you're in that situation,
and he's in pain. They're spraying him in the eyes as he's laying on the ground too. He's in pain. Like, what do you expect is going to happen with this guy? You know? And the problem is everybody ascribing intent to Pretti. We just don't know. We don't know what he was going to do. I don't see him reaching for a weapon. So a lot of people have commented to the videos that I've posted, and they said he's reaching for his weapon, and I say he was disarmed before he was shot, so he had no weapon to reach for. And they said, well, they don't know that he was reaching for his weapon. You can't. I didn't see that, but you can't say whether or not he was. You can't. That's not a good argument. You're ascribing intent. He was going to go murder these cops. You don't know what was in his head. What we do know is the action. We know that the cop drew and killed him after he was already disarmed. We know that for a fact. We saw it. It's there. And so we don't have to ascribe intent to the ICE. Actually, and the arguments about intent to are actually damn them even more, because they say, oh, well, he was known because of that altercation 2 or 3 weeks ago. He was known by ICE, so of course they were all ramped up when they saw him this time. If they knew him and they were all ramped up because they wanted some sort of revenge, that actually makes it worse for them. That's a worse argument.
Yeah, and I've wondered a few things, in light of that earlier video from almost 2 weeks earlier, right? Wasn't it 11 days before the fatal incident? So, I've wondered a few things that I don't know if we'll ever get straight answers to, or if it's even possible. But one of them is, were any of the ICE agents involved in the fatal incident?
Right.
Also the ones that were involved in that previous incident? We may never know because they're typically wearing masks. Pretti's not wearing a mask though. But that might be a factor if, those specific agents were then the ones who were confronting him and attacking him and everything there, then there is a case to be made that there's some sort of revenge kind of motive, personally on their part, let's get this troublemaker. The other thing that I've wondered is, and this might be impossible to answer, but was Pretti carrying during that earlier incident?
It's a good question too. Yeah.
There's probably no way to answer that. The only person who might know is him, and it's too late for that.
Yeah.
But that could make a difference just in terms of trying to figure out what the heck he was thinking. Now I'll say for the record, I think he absolutely had the right legally. He definitely did, to be carrying in a public street in a state he was licensed to carry in. I would argue, on the other hand, and this is not to be victim blaming or say what happened to him was okay or justified, but, I would argue that if you're going to be involved in some sort of protest, something along the lines of civil disobedience or whatever, even if you have the legal right to carry, I think it is very unwise. And, I don't go to protests and things like that. I typically think the risk to reward ratio for being involved in any sort of protest, especially these days, is very much, no. Especially like you don't know, who are the federal agitators amongst the protesters. Like you just don't know.
You don't know.
And something happens, even if you're totally in the right and you're the victim, you don't know how it can be portrayed and spun and whatever.
Totally. And January 6th, like we saw what happened there. There were a lot of innocent people not doing anything violent at all that were targeted, many incarcerated without a trial. For a long period of time, basically in kind of like they're being tortured, and a lot of them in isolation for a while. So you just never know what's going to happen. I agree. I wouldn't do that either, and I wouldn't have cared if I blame him absolutely. Like he probably should not blame like he should have died, but if I were him, I wouldn't have carried.
Yeah. That's what I was going to say is that. It would be one thing if he was just like walking to work or something like that. But by the way, he probably, as far as I know, unless you like work there as security, he works in a VA hospital. As far as I know, you can't carry a weapon there, even if you've got it's one of those prohibited places, like typically federal buildings, unless, you work there as part of the security, you can't carry there, even if you have a legitimate license or whatever. Right. Even here in Florida, you can't legally carry in most, if not all hospitals, even not federal ones. But, suppose he had worked in a place where it was legal for him to carry and he was just on his way to work and he's just carrying as he normally does every day. And then he happened to see this incident unfolding and stepped in to try and help this woman.
Yeah.
That's a different scenario, but I think it's pretty clear, like he was an activist. He had been involved in previous incidents. So he's going there knowing that he's getting involved in these situations where it might turn into physical altercations. And chose to carry. Now, maybe his thinking was, well, if just a chaotic riot breaks out, I want to be able to protect myself. I don't think he had his intent to like actually get into a shootout with ICE agents. I don't think there's any evidence that he was that deranged.
What's the upside of that? Like you wouldn't do it that way. There's no upside. You're gonna die. You're gonna die. Like there's no upside.
Yeah. Again, if that was his motive, you would think that he would like maybe shoot them from a distance from concealment,
do it different
with a rifle or something like that. If his goal was just to shoot federal agents, which I don't think it was. So I think he made an unwise choice. He probably thought, if things just turn into a complete chaotic riot, I want to be able to protect myself.
Yeah.
But this is going way back. But when Paul Revere set out on his midnight ride, back in 1775. One detail that a lot of people don't know is he specifically did not bring any weapons, even though it was common for people just traveling on the roads back then to carry weapons. Yeah. He specifically chose not to carry weapons. And the reason he did was because he chose not to carry weapons was that he thought, well, if I'm stopped by any British soldiers, if I'm packing a weapon, even a pistol, even if I have the total right to do so, that's going to immediately escalate the situation. And guess what? Paul Revere did get caught by redcoats. He didn't make it all the way to Concord that day. And they confiscated his horse, but they released him because he was unarmed and some other things happened that caused him to release him. But, my point is that like that was the right move on Paul Revere's part, because if he had been carrying a weapon or two, things with those redcoats might have escalated, out of hand, and Paul Revere could easily have been shot on the spot.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think he acted responsibly. That obviously that doesn't and shouldn't have a death penalty associated with that. But I have the same issues with Renee Good too. Mm-hmm. She's a mom with 3 kids at home, and she's driving into a protest. And can you imagine with an armed officer pointing a weapon at you, you start to. It looks like she was driving away, but whatever. Drive towards him or drive away. Would you ever do that? There's no way I would put myself in harm's way like that. It just seems like a very irresponsible move on her part. Doesn't mean she should, like the guy probably wasn't in danger. It didn't look like he was in danger. People said that he was like brushed with the vehicle. I don't know. It was going so slow. Probably get out of the way. But regardless, like you have to say like her actions were not very smart. She did a dumb thing here. And Pretti, being an antagonist and being part of the Signal group and and being a foot soldier for Waltz and NGOs and all that bullshit. Like, why would you want to be a pawn in that? They're never going to get touched. You are. Just irresponsible in that way. But again, does not deserve a fucking death sentence, especially after he was apprehended. Like, you're not, their job, ICE's job is not to be judge, jury, executioner. No, their job is to apprehend. And if it's an American citizen, put him in front of a damn judge. And this is like a terrible PR situation too for Trump, the Trump administration. We should definitely talk about the tactics here, because I agree. I think if your goal is to do what you said you were going to do for the last 10 years, which is build a wall, get rid of a bunch of illegal aliens, which I support, removing illegals from the country. I'm a pretty hardcore libertarian, but you have to think about, who has the most right to the country. You have to also think about the fact that immigration has been weaponized against us for decades. All of those things, probably a different conversation. But in general, if your goal is to try to get as many out as possible, this is the worst way to go about it. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. How are you going to, with 20,000 ICE agents, bully your way, like warfare your way into getting a bunch of illegal aliens out of here? No, there's way better tactics. It's, robbing the fire. So I listened to Dave Smith and Part of the Problem this past week in Robbing the Fire. I don't know, he's probably not the first to say it, but great idea. He said they're cooperating. Law enforcement is cooperating in red states. In like Texas, for example, they are deporting like 10 times the amount of people from Texas than they are Minnesota. Well, if the goal is to get more people out, go to red states that will work with you instead of blue states like Minnesota, where the government has told police departments you can't respond to 911 calls from ICE agents. You can't assist them. Fine, fuck it. We need to get 20 million out. Go where the least resistance is going to be to that end.
Yeah. And also, if you did that, couple things. One is, it would probably cause at least some of the people who currently live in those red states that, the local authorities are cooperating. It would cause at least some of those illegal immigrants there to relocate to sanctuary cities.
Yep.
And then you end up sort of like when Ron DeSantis sent some illegal immigrants in Florida up to Martha's Vineyard and caused, the Obama limousine liberal crowd to expose their own hypocrisy when they're like, oh, we need to accept all the illegals. And then as soon as they show up in their neighborhood, in their wealthy area, then suddenly it's like, oh, we got to get these people out of here. We can't handle this. And it's like, well, how do you think people in like working class neighborhoods in other parts of the country feel about this? Yeah. So it would cause more illegals to congregate in the sanctuary cities and might cause the local citizens to rethink things once the problems get increasingly severe. Even a lot of fairly ideological Democrats might start to say, you know what, this whole idea of just let's accept anybody is crazy and not working. The second thing is that ICE and I'm now questioning how much recently hired ICE agents are trained. I know they've had manpower shortages and everything like that. One of the things that's been said is that the main guy who did the shooting at Pretti had been on the job for 8 years. Well, if he had been on the job for 8 years, that means when was he hired? Early in Trump's first term. Yeah. So it means that he probably is somebody who joined ICE out of like a zealous, like, I'm going to get those immigrants out of here or whatever, like this, gung-ho attitude. And I wonder, anytime you have a law enforcement department that is hiring a lot of people in a hurry, screening and training tend to get reduced. Yep. And an example of that I'm familiar with is Miami in the 80s. Anyone who's ever watched the great documentary Cocaine Cowboys and seen how much, the Miami police were like, so many of them were corrupt and, on the take and whatever in the 80s. Well, Miami was exploding in population in the 80s, and also the crime was exploding because of all the Cocaine Cowboy stuff. And so the police departments in the area were like, we just need to, get more cops. Well, if you're hiring, cops as fast as you can, you're probably going to be scrimping a bit on screening and training. And so you might have a combination of a self-selection bias where someone who joins ICE during the Trump administration is like a hardcore ideologue for, overzealous border enforcement, let's say. And, maybe not good if like they're, already like psychologically predisposed to want to use excessive force. And then, is there adequate training and screening going on?
Yep.
And then on top of that, even if there's adequate training for their main job, ICE, as far as I know, has no real emphasis in their training on things like crowd control. And like local city cops and stuff usually have better training in that. So again, if you choose to go to cities in these red state areas where the locals actually are happy to cooperate with ICE, then the locals can, provide crowd control, and, hopefully they're more skilled and experienced in dealing with those sorts of situations like big demonstrations and whatever. And they also have more tools in their toolbox than ICE probably does to deal with those sorts of situations. And so not that those sorts of cops always behave well, not at all, but at least like they're more likely than ICE agents to do a better job of handling protesters and things like this.
You make good points there too. And of course, if it's a local police force, a lot of times, maybe not so much in Minneapolis, but a little bit, especially in smaller places, it's like your community that you're in too. And so you have some reputation on the line as well, and familiarity. You don't want to see your own place that you're living in devolve into chaos and to be a war zone in the streets. Like you don't, it's your community. But if you're ICE, you're coming from all over the place. You're deployed there. It's kind of like you're deployed overseas or in a different country's war zone. So especially if you're not, as you mentioned, if you like came on board in the Trump administration. Actually, I think the training right now is 47 days because of what number president is he? 47? What is this? 47?
Yeah, I guess because with Trump, as with Grover Cleveland, they're counting him as like two presidents because it's not consecutive terms. So yeah, I guess it's, his first term, he was considered the 45th president.
45th. And so he's 47th.
This one is the 47th. Yeah.
So I think in honor of Trump, I think it's 47 days of training. That's what I heard. I don't know. That might be ridiculous. But anyway, even so, it makes sense too. Like if you were hired under Trump and maybe you're gung-ho because you're a big Trump guy and you're deployed in a very blue state, you might think of them as this is a kind of a foreign adversary instead of a community that you belong in. So that makes a lot of sense. There are other tactics too. I mean, the big problem here, and what there are a lot of reasons why immigration has been weaponized against the American population, but it's turning off the fucking money. It's like Congress again is voting to fund to provide benefits for illegal aliens. It's like I think it was $5 billion this time. It's crazy. I mean, that tactic would be an easy thing to do that causes no violence. No violence creates no conflict. If you turn off the money, you will
reduce the incentives.
Reduce the incentives. Even pay people to go back to their fucking countries. The number of self-deports would go up. And it's kind of, it would be no conflict, no violent interaction way to do it. And I wonder if that would have as many self-deports as ICE is going to deport this year with their 20,000 person manpower. I mean, it seems like just a very easy way to start this process.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I think anyone who's not just a complete, mindless propagandist for the Trump administration would be willing to admit is that the Trump administration, especially in the second term, has been characterized by a huge amount of immaturity and unprofessionalism and strategic stupidity.
Yeah.
And so it's like if you were mature and professional and strategically savvy, you'd be considering these options, that we've talked about as like, what are the least invasive ways we can get the maximum of the policy that we say we want, which I'm now skeptical how much the Trump administration even really wants to actually reduce the number of illegal immigrants and so forth.
Yeah.
Like you would say, okay, our goal is to minimize illegal immigrants living in this country. But we don't want to make the optics so terrible that we turn middle of the road people completely against us when they're on our side to begin with. And what's going to give us the most bang for the buck in all senses of the word. And so this is, not what you do. And then it obviously comes from the top. Trump is so narcissistic and immature. And, I've argued in a recent podcast of my show that I'm convinced he's either a psychopath or sociopath. But, when you look at Kash Patel, Kristi Noem, all these people, like they don't come across as serious people. Like they come across as like, teenagers with a beef or something like this. I almost, I suspect it's possible that part of why this is going on in Minnesota in this way is simply Trump wanting to personally fuck with Tim Walz and Ilhan Omar and those people. That he just wants to fuck with them.
Yep.
And so that's why he's choosing like one of the least bang for the buck strategies to actually deal with the real problem that the American people want dealt with. And not choosing some of these other options, which like should seem obvious, I think, to anybody who's just like rational and calm and objective and saying, okay, if we want to try and, reduce this problem as much as we can, what are the smartest ways we can go about it that will actually give us the results we want? But also, you would think, obviously it's not the case, but you would think that somebody would at least think like, we want to minimize the impact on people who are here legally, especially citizens, but even just legal residents. We don't want to make people feel like they're in a Gestapo state. We want to make this as minimum of like brute force as possible. Those sorts of things, because again, a lot of politically middle of the road people have been for years wanting more immigration enforcement.
Yep.
But as soon as you start doing these jackboot things that are, very obvious and ham-fisted, a lot of those reasonable people are going to go, I don't know, maybe the other side had a point, and they might even eventually get persuaded into the open borders camp just by the bad optics.
He's losing the PR battle, and they're just going to get destroyed in the midterm elections. Like the economy, what's gonna go in his favor? Like economy's not great. He's lying about the economy. Economy's not great. The immigration optics are terrible. There was something like a 20-point swing. He was positive poll numbers on how he was handling immigration, and then within the last couple weeks, he's completely lost it. He's now underwater on that. He's losing that PR battle big time. And actually, this is a good case for Tim Walz. Tim Walz was under the gun too. He's not even running for re-election because of the $9 billion in fraud in his state, and he was losing that battle. This is hit to his benefit. Like Trump is losing to Walz right now in this tete-a-tete, I guess. But no, if he wanted to win the PR battle, he would concentrate in red states. He would get the maximum, most efficient bang for his buck with the least amount of violence possible. He would make sure that deportations were happening at any time there was interaction with the state. If someone is going for benefits or someone's trying to get a driver's license or whatever it is, every time that happens, deport. And instead of doing this extremely aggressive, really militaristic process. And so he's shooting himself in the foot. It's not providing any sort of result. And I think it's like completely okay for someone to be pro-immigration pro-deporting illegal immigrants and having some concerns with their tactics and concerns when you see someone get murdered who's been disarmed.
Yeah. And this is actually touches on a larger theme I've talked about before over the years, but I think it's one of those things that's so important, but is rarely brought up in like any corner of American political discourse, and that is evaluating things not just in terms of the stated ends, but in terms of the means.
Yeah.
So American political discourse seems to typically just focused on the ends, and so they'll say like, do you want there to be 9/11s every day? Right. Well, if you don't, you have to support us invading Iraq and all these other things that, or the left saying, do you want poor people to be helped to have a better life and whatever? Well, then if you do, you must support our version of the welfare state. And means matter a lot, and I can completely agree with someone's ends, at least their stated ends, and assuming they're being honest about those ends, but also vehemently reject their means. And so, there's a lot of things that I would want as policies, but if you told me like, all right, we're going to have to, do some horrible thing and slaughter a bunch of people, innocent people to do that, I'd be like, well, I'm not going along with that. I might even agree with what you claim is your reason for doing this. But if your means are repugnant, I'm not going along with it.
This is Matt Walsh, Cernovich, right now. This is like a number of like Daily Wire conservatives. This is how they are presenting things. It's like, it's so two-dimensional. Like there's not, how can you not see the nuance in the third dimension here when you're saying, listen, Tim Pool, he's like, I'm the boot now. It's like, what? Is it number one? You're nothing. Like, you're not the boot. You do a show. You're not part of the state. You didn't join ICE and start this process. You're not the boot right now. So stupid. And like the boot just as an end itself, like that's not I mean, how do they not understand? You go through the whole early 2020s, the COVID lockdown, the Jan 6 stuff, all of that, and not come to the realization that whoever is in power gets to wield the state, and that you probably don't want to accept when the state is doing something immoral and terrible to the people you don't like. How do you not make the recognition that they could just turn around and do it to you once they're in power? How does he not? Does he not get this?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the smarter people among that group get it, but they're just playing the game that they're playing for their own reasons. Like they understand it, as a theoretical proposition, but then there is this school of thought that seems to have been really accelerated amongst the right during the COVID years, and I understand it. Like, I understand the visceral emotion behind it, but like, are we supposed to be just as much governed by our most hysterical emotions as like some, pink-haired woke they them or something like this? There's the school of thought that's like, we just have to use brute force. We just have to brute force against all of our ideological enemies and opponents. And to me, what it reminds me of is William F. Buckley, just a few years into the Cold War, in that famous article in the early 50s in Commonweal magazine, that where William F. Buckley is saying, oh, yes, we want to have like freedom and free markets and all these sorts of things in America, but unfortunately there's a worldwide communist threat, and so for now we have to, in his words, have a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores.
Buchanan was like that too at the time. He was a Cold War hawk.
Yeah, and it's like, well, wait a minute. If we're worried the Soviets might somehow take us over and oppress us with an oppressive authoritarian police state, you think the best solution to that is to just create our own authoritarian, oppressive police state? I don't understand why we're not like teaming up with the Soviets if our goal is just to simply have our own, totalitarian state. Like, if you, like Nietzsche said, you have to be careful when you're battling with monsters that you don't become one.
Yeah.
And, create the very thing that you claim to be opposing and that maybe you did oppose when you started out.
Yeah. What do you think about? So I've now stated it a couple times. You didn't really react negatively to it, so maybe you agree. But what do you think about this looking like a color revolution in Minnesota? I mean, I just see you have NGOs pouring money in, elites stoking the flames, and then all these like foot soldiers around just creating conflict. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I definitely think that's likely. I think there's, a fair amount of evidence to suggest that. I can't say for sure like a whole lot of detail about that, but we know that there was some of that going on with the 2020 BLM riots and protests and everything like that.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, sorry, I know you're taking a drink, but like, if that's the case, because so they're like Patel says he's investigating that the NGOs coming in here and bringing money and support and infrastructure to this. It's like, why? Where's Bondi? Like, why are if Frey, the mayor, I think it's Frey or Fry, whatever, Fry, the mayor, and the lieutenant governor and Waltz are participating. Like, where are they on this? But anyway, continue your thought.
Well, what I always wonder is how much of this is a divide and rule strategy that is, very much like pro wrestling in a way, where the real kind of like oligarchs who, control things from the top, the most of whom don't really have elective office and many of whom, the public doesn't even really know who they are. Those people tend to not really be ideological other than in the sense of they want to maximize their own money and power, and rule.
Right.
And so this is why you very often will find like Wall Street giving huge amounts of money to both political parties' candidates and that sort of thing. It's like they don't really, they're not really fired up about the social issues of the two-party platforms. It's more just like we want to make sure we got some leverage with whoever wins. And in general, these people tend to just want to maximize their own money and power and prevent themselves from being overthrown by any sort of like actual, whether literal or metaphorical populist revolution. And so how do you keep average people from teaming up against the real oligarchs, the real owners of this country? Well, you get them constantly fighting each other. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book, divide and rule. And so, if you're like a typical kind of right-wing person, you'll see all this stuff about Soros and color revolution stuff and think, oh, this is, the left-wing agenda. And not realizing like it's possible the people at the billionaire level don't really care if the authoritarian regime that, ends the last shreds of the Bill of Rights and the Republic and whatever, they don't really care if it's a right-wing, decorated one or a left-wing decorated one.
Yeah.
And so they're just as happy if like, Trump ends up instituting a full-blown police state, or if he doesn't, but his successor does as a reaction, right? That whole, dialectic idea.
Why do you think that it feels like it seems like, and again, maybe I'm just misremembering or not knowing, but why does it always seem like it's the left causes that are funded and organized in this way? Do you see that on the right side? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there definitely is some. There definitely is like foundations and corporate money and what have you. I mean, a lot of it on the right is in the form of the neocon stuff, like all those, Zionist billionaires who fund sort of neocon think tanks and who, manipulate the internal politics of the Republican Party in order to always try and shove neocon candidates ahead of like, kind of old school nationalist conservative types. So,
and the neocons have definitely infiltrated the left now too. So it's now at kind of that level. It doesn't really matter who's in power because mostly the same stuff happens. It seems, and maybe that just at the foot soldier level, it hasn't really caught up there yet.
Yes, and I also would say that left leaning people tend to be more predisposed to engaging in things like protests and civil
Right.
disobedience, and some of them even in riots. And so, if you want to rile them up, that's kind of the way you do it. Whereas right-wingers, by temperament and sort of background and that sort of thing, they tend not to, they're more likely to be people with, like, they're running businesses, or they have, very time and energy absorbing full-time jobs, those sorts of things, families, whatever. And so just in general, right-wingers, even when they're really agitated about a cause, they tend to be less quick to resort to street protests and those sorts of things. And so they get riled up by different means, I would say, and into different activities. And so if you're trying to rile up both of them against each other so that the billionaires at the top or whatever get to just keep your lofty position and maybe even increase your power over the plebs, you would tailor how you're doing it in terms of the means and the channels towards each side, I think.
Yeah, maybe one that I don't know if this really fits, but it could be, you could say, was sort of a right-wing protest that had some legs. Didn't happen here, but it might have been the trucker protest in COVID time period. I mean, there was some funding. It seemed more like grassroots funding at the time, and I agreed with the cause. So maybe I would also blind myself to outside money, or more corporate money coming in and supporting them. But maybe that could be an example of a right side one. But maybe I realized I didn't define color revolution or what that is. How do you feel about explaining that concept a little bit for people listening?
So these are things they've most commonly happened or been attempted in the former Soviet sphere of influence, in a lot of those areas of kind of the western fringes of Russia, the eastern fringes of Europe, some of which were integral parts of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union existed, some of which have become independent states since then, some of which have been, or at least were, still parts of the Russian Federation after the Soviet Union fell. But basically, it is a way of using covert means, usually a combination of intelligence agencies and so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which, often are just adjuncts
Funded.
of intelligence agencies. Yeah.
By the government.
Yeah, so you use that to create, or maybe not always create completely, but greatly amplify, and in some cases absolutely just create from whole cloth, dissident movements, protest movements, and things in countries that you don't like their existing government, in order to try and overthrow it, without having to have a full-fledged 2003 Iraq-style invasion. Regime change war. And so, an early example of this that predates the color revolution terminology is the CIA overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, where, were there some dissidents in Iran? I'm sure there were, but the CIA went in there not with guns, but with mostly money to create a what appeared to be a grassroots, anti-government protest regime that then could be, leveraged to overthrow the government there, and hopefully make it look like it was a legit homegrown thing and not grassroots largely being funded from outside. So, you see this in Ukraine, in Georgia, in a lot of those sorts of places more recently. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they aren't. But the goal is generally to remove someone. They'll say it's because that person or that regime is, oppressive or whatever. But really what it is that person is not complying with the sort of like globalist, bankster establishment interests. They're trying to actually be independent, and, maybe they're trying to not pay back Wall Street, the ridiculous loans that their predecessors incurred or whatever. And so really what it's about is installing a sock puppet regime in its place, and to try and do that in a way that looks like it's a legit, populist uprising, even though it's not.
Yeah. And so it just seemed so overt in Ukraine as the example, because you had the Yanukovych government. Was this 2017 when this happened? He was 2013 or 2017. Now I'm mixing my dates, but anyway, he was
14?
14, something like that. So his government was getting friendlier with Russia, and the European oligarchs didn't like that very much. So U.S. CIA, through federal funds, funded a bunch of NGOs to go in and provide a lot of support for on the ground foot soldiers, and that it worked. It fucking worked. It was crazy. And it was why I say it was so overt is because we had senators and other folks in the government like over there, providing support, being very vocal about what was going to happen. We had Newland on a phone call, like talking to Biden or talking to someone, talking about who was going to take over when Yanukovych was removed. So that was so overt. And I wonder now my wonder is if that's happening again around right now. But yeah, Color Revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot of the same tactics and methods for sure. Yeah. Now, what their goal is, I don't know. Like, are they trying, to overthrow the Minnesota, state government in some way? Are they? Because I don't think that anything that happens in Minnesota threatens the existence of the U.S. federal government.
Probably not.
As a regime. So
I wonder if it's more about just the policy, the immigration policy that's been with us for the last 30, 40 years or something. They want that continued, which would eventually get to the ends that these folks want, which is to make sure that anybody who's voting is voting for the Democrat side of the political spectrum. Maybe that's just it.
Yeah, and even on the immigration thing, it's in part another dimension of divide and rule.
Right.
So you can split people into political and ideological camps, but then you can also split people into infinite, ethnic and national camps and whatever. And so, if you are someone who wants to rule over people and have them be like almost, neo serfs and you're the neo aristocrats, well, it's a lot easier to rule over serfs that don't feel like they're part of the same group. Yeah. And, the class dimension is going to make them tend to think, hey, look, me and my fellow serf, we're on the same team and the aristocrats, exploiting both of us. But if the serfs speak different languages and are totally different physically in appearance and have totally different cultures and these sorts of things, then the serfs are going to be even more inclined than if they were just split over politics and ideology to be very resistant to teaming up. And so, you're never going to have a cohesive populist opposition to the oligarchs if people are divided in, that's also why they stress the male versus female divide and all these sorts of things. It's all ways to make the peasants feel that their enemies are the other peasants who are different from them, rather than it's, JP Morgan and all the usual suspects.
Yeah, here's some signs that you're living through a color revolution. NGO funding, encrypted communication infrastructure, training and operational manuals, political elite involvement, providing cover, happening, sympathetic media amplification, any martyrs, emotional escalation, and deniability layers. Those are all kind of attributes of it. And it just, at least a lot of those it seemed like that's what's going on in Minnesota. And since we sort of saw this playbook before, effective, but not maybe as effective. Maybe the reason why Black Lives Matter and kind of that wasn't as effective is because it was so spread out across the country in a lot of kind of major cities across the country. And this is so concentrated. And so all eyes are on it. They can do kind of a lot of damage all in one place. And it provides the same sort of media bang for your buck without the same cost of trying to do this everywhere. But yeah, I mean, it looks like it, and it's scary. So any other thoughts about what's going on in Minnesota before we wrap up? I think we covered a lot of things here. I think it's important to talk about the Walt stuff and what's going on in Minnesota from like a from a fraud perspective, or at least mention those things, because people might consider us leftists if we with kind of the first half of us talking today, because we're so critical about ICE. But it's important to know that it sounds like you and I both agree that we support removing illegal aliens, at least to a certain extent, but just want to make sure that the tactics are like thought through and smart, and are being the most efficient with the least amount of violence possible.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of just, starting, I would say start with two things first and foremost. Number one is to reduce the influx as close to zero as possible, of illegals for the time being, which, I don't really know firsthand, but from what I've heard, the Trump administration has been fairly effective in doing. And then, the other would be, like, before you even go around, I would almost take more of a mostly passive approach, which is seal the entrances, so to speak, and then do everything you possibly can to reduce the incentives for those already here to stay. Make it, as difficult and inconvenient for them so that they self-deport as much as possible. And then, I would not be in favor of just like actively going out looking for trouble, so to speak. In most cases, I would take more of kind of what you said earlier, of kind of a passive approach, in the sense of, an illegal goes down to a government office to get welfare or whatever, and then you figure out that he's an illegal and say, all right, well, you're out of here, rather than the spectacle, which plays into the, pro open borders crowds narrative, the spectacle of, these masked guys in tactical gear, going around, dragging people off and getting the wrong guy, and, throwing women on the ground and all these sorts of things.
Yeah. Do you have, last thing I want to ask you actually is, what do you think about, I mean, there's a divide between libertarian folks too. I mean, this is really kind of a hot topic during the last election between libertarians, is those who were considered open border and those who were considered closed border. What do you think about, the arguments that open border libertarians have on this issue? Like, I get it. Like, in a purely market-based, nap believing anarcho-capitalist world with legitimate like private property protection, and you don't have all of this like public property ridiculousness and monopoly on state, it would be up to the property owners on who they want to invite onto their property. We don't live in that scenario, so you have to be real about where we're living right now, and acknowledge that immigration has been weaponized against us. So what are your thoughts on their, I guess, arguments?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think those people tend to miss, because they're usually not super deeply read in like the details and complexities of history. They're usually, if they are deeply read, it's more in kind of like abstract philosophizing and things like this, and they spend most of their time there, and I understand that point of view. I understand like trying to figure out, like, in hypothetical scenarios and abstract sort of situations. But I also understand that reality is always infinitely more complex. And so, there's a lot of things I've considered doing an episode of my own show with my thoughts on immigration, because again, I'm generally anti just let's let everybody in who wants to come in, and in some cases even like subsidize it and help logistically them to get here and all these sorts of things. But I'm also not in favor of authoritarian police states and whatever, but culture does matter, in the sense that I think it is true that certain cultures just by the accidents of history and whatever have evolved to be more amenable to what we would think of as a free society than others. And it doesn't mean there aren't individual exceptions. Somebody who is from a culture that generally isn't fertile ground for kind of libertarian attitudes, because it's an attitude as much as it is like these explicit, beliefs.
Yeah.
It's sort of like an attitude and a mindset too. There are exceptions. There might be someone who comes from a culture that's not that way, who's just a weird exception. But if you have a community that is supposed to be predicated on certain shared principles, and you have huge numbers of people flooding into that community who don't share those principles, it raises this, practical problem of what happens if you get colonized, especially once you have, voting as a thing.
Yeah.
You get colonized by people who are adamantly opposed to the people who are already theirs, values and ideology and so forth. And there are lots of examples of this in history. And one that I think of in this regard is colonial Pennsylvania. So early colonial Pennsylvania was all run by the Quakers. William Penn was in charge, and he was a devout Quaker. And the Quakers had a lot of admirable values. A lot of their values are like just mainstream things that almost everybody believes today, but were radical at the time. And, one admirable thing about early Pennsylvania is that they really went out of their way to get along with the Indians, with the natives, in their area. William Penn really was trying to be a good guy in regards to that. Like, we're not going to steal anybody's land. We're only going to buy it by consensual agreement, and not even any of this where we trick them because they're not familiar with our language and our laws. And we're going to not, be aggressive. We're going to not, we're going to avoid conflict with the natives. And it worked for a while, because it was primarily just Quakers and other groups that shared a lot of those same values who moved there, like Mennonites and stuff like that. And it worked. They got along without having constant war with their native neighbors. But then after a few generations, another thing the Quakers had was a very open immigration policy, again, because of their ideology. They had this idea like, we're all God's children, and we all have the inner light. So, we're not. So they had one of the most wide, all the colonies had different immigration policies. Some were tighter, some were looser. Pennsylvania had possibly, I think, the loosest of all. Very few limitations on who could move there. And so after a while, you started getting lots of people moving there who did not share the Quakers' values at all. And the most numerous group in the 1700s were the Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish had a very aggressive, militaristic culture. And it had been built from the Scottish Protestants colonizing Northern Ireland in the 1600s. Right. And what are they doing? They're moving in to take land from the native population there by force. Yeah. And so a bunch of them then came from Northern Ireland over to, a lot of them came to Pennsylvania, and they were the complete opposite of the Quakers in terms of getting along with the Indians and having a peaceful policy and whatever. And they came in large enough numbers and could vote. So, because Pennsylvania also, thanks to the Quakers, had a very democratic colonial government. And so the Scots-Irish in Pennsylvania started to steer Pennsylvania away from its distinctive Quaker, what I would say anyway, are in many ways admirable, distinctive policies towards being more like the other colonies, where they're getting into wars with the natives and having conflict and, taking land by force and all this sort of thing. So that's just one example of many that I can think of in history where you have a community that, gets undone by huge numbers of people coming in a short amount of time who have completely opposed values and beliefs and worldview to the people who are already there and who set it up.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, as a liberty-minded person, I'm sober to the fact that in a voluntary society, you have to be able to disassociate, because you don't, you want to make sure that whoever's on your property or in your community, contractually based community, your neighbors are people that you can live with. And so it makes sense that you would exclude people that you can't. You would never have open borders. You can't have open borders in a libertarian society. It would not work, because you get infiltrated by people who do not believe what you believe. As the example that you just gave, they would take over and your society's done. So absolutely. I mean, it's very liberty minded to be able to disassociate. It's voluntary associations, full stop. including who you live with, who your neighbors are. So, yes, thanks for that history on Pennsylvania. I didn't know that stuff. It's one of the reasons why I'm happy to do content with you, is because you bring some of that to the table that I just don't have. It's very interesting. But anyway, yeah, thanks. I think we should probably wrap here, unless you have any final thoughts. But this has been great. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Let's see. Did I mention anything, or is there anything I wanted to mention that I did not? Oh, just one last thing. And this is just rhetorical, and we again may never have good answers to this. Another thing that I've just wondered about is what exactly truly was Pretti's ideology. Not that matters to the the legality of what happened to him or anything like that, but more just from the standpoint of trying to understand the whole situation and event. Obviously he's sympathetic to the anti immigration enforcement side of things.
Yep.
But I haven't seen anything that really spells out was he really an Antifa person? It seems at least possible to me, based on the fact that we haven't really heard any detail, that it's possible he might have been an open borders libertarian, because Antifa types normally don't
carry, do they?
Especially going through the process of, even if they carry a weapon, they don't go through the process of getting a concealed carry permit. And so, I kind of thought a little bit of like the Boogaloo Boys or something like that. Like, was Pretti an open borders libertarian who was there, and that's why he would be sort of temperamentally, leaning towards carrying a concealed weapon and having a permit to do so? And again, I have no idea, but it does change just the overall picture depending on what exactly it was that he believed and thought he was doing and was intending to do. Again, doesn't change the immediate situation of what happened or the legalities of it or anything, but I don't know,
but
the Daily Wire change the narrative.
The Daily Wire conservatives are happy to call him a communist. Like, they're happy to ascribe what his intentions without really knowing. We might know if he had social media presence, or if his family gives us information. We may find out about that. But I had that's a great question, and I had the same question. I was like, do we know that he was Antifa? Do we know what he was doing there? Obviously, he was agitating, and he's in the Signal group, and so maybe that is. But it could be that that's what's organized, and so that's where he went. But I didn't know what his ideology was, couldn't find that anywhere, and I didn't want to pass judgment until we found out.
Yeah. And at this point, I mean, they've the administration and the various corners of the media have lied about so many things related to this incident, that even if they came out and said, like, oh, here's his, social media where he's, talking about we need to install woke Marxism or something like this, like, I don't even know if I would necessarily take it at face value as being accurate and truthful and so forth. But anyway, that's just one thing that I just wanted to throw out there that we hadn't hit on. So yeah,
good point. Okay, cool. Well, thanks, TJ, and this is a wrap. But talk to you soon.
All right, sounds good.